Hello, everyone. I am Siri Vaith, Executive Director of CFRI, Cystic Fibrosis Research Incorporated, and it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome you to CFRI's first installment of our four-part financial planning podcast series. As we'll discuss today, the advancements in therapies and treatments for CF has led many adults with CF to face a new, exciting, but possibly stressful challenge: planning for one's financial security into the future. And of course, this is even more relevant today with the emotional and financial stress that many people are experiencing due to COVID-19. CFRI is very grateful to Global Genes for providing us with a financial advocacy rare impact grant to support this webinar series. And they're supporting our efforts to expand education and awareness supporting financial planning and financial literacy. In 2 weeks, we'll have a webinar with financial planner and CPA Eric Puzia, who himself has a daughter with cystic fibrosis. And he will give an overview of financial planning strategies. And this will be followed by a webinar about 2 weeks later with the wonderful Beth Sufyan, an attorney who herself has CF and who's the national expert on CF and SSDI benefits. And then the series will conclude with a webinar on special needs trusts and other retirement asset strategies presented by Kirsten Howe, an attorney with expertise in those areas. As always, I want to remind people that the information we share today, any financial strategies, are just that. They're strategies, and you should not make any radical decisions about your personal individual situation without consulting with an expert. So now we get to move on to the substance. I am very honored to be joined today by a wonderful panel of adults with CF. Jacob Fraker lives in California, where he's the Housing and Health Recovery Coordinator with the Governor's Office of Emergency Services in Sacramento. He's a recent graduate of UC Berkeley with his master's in social welfare, with an emphasis on policy change. Georgia Brown is 49. She is joining us all the way from Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome, Georgia. And Becca Mueller is 39 and lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She's a genetic counselor and a doctoral student. So welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences. Just to start the conversation, financial planning is a challenge for everyone. This is not just something limited to the world of CF and people with chronic disease. It's really worsened for us in the United States. We are notorious for having poor financial literacy. And we are one of the largest world economies, but our adult financial literacy level is measured at around 57%, which is just about where many, many third world nations rank. In 2015, researchers found that only 30% of Americans were able to answer 3 simple financial questions about inflation, interest compounding, and risk diversification. And this translates, it has huge impacts when we make decisions about buying cars. Should we lease? Should we own? Could we buy a house? Should we rent? What's a fixed rate mortgage? What's adjustable? What is the best way to assess different life insurance and health insurance plans? So in the not too distant past, life expectancy for those with CF didn't extend far beyond the age of a college graduate. And so for many people, the overarching sense was that life would be short, there'd be no need to attend college, pursue a long-term career, ponder health insurance coverage, or save money for retirement. But with improvements in therapies, most notably for those who can use the CFTR modulator Trikafta, there's a growing awareness and stress about financial planning. And this really came up at a recent CFRI CF Summer Retreat, where there was a session requested because it is a source of stress. And, we didn't know what to expect. And I think Georgia can attest that the response was much greater, I think, than anticipated. There are many, many conversations. Becca, you were there as well, correct? And the conversation went on so long, it spilled into through the break and towards the next session. So that was really the key for us to think about what can we do to help improve all of our own literacy and our ability to plan. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to the experts. And I think I'll start with you, Jacob, whether you can share your thoughts about financial planning for the future, and whether these thoughts have changed recently due to health status, new therapies, age, what have you.
Yeah, so it's certainly been a journey as it relates to how I view financial planning. So I think that when I was first growing up, like the idea, right, at 16 years old was kind of the age expectancy that my mom and my father had gotten. And so the idea of retirement was just a complete like misnomer for me. It wasn't anything that I had ever thought about. It wasn't something that I thought I needed to think about. Um, I just figured we'd just keep going and see how long we go, and that'll just be the end of it. And so the idea of going to college was kind of in my mind. The idea of a long-term career was not. It wasn't something that I thought I'd be able to obtain. I was really great at saving money as a kid, saving my allowance and things like that, and, saving up to buy a car or, just things that I want. But the idea of having some like a 401k or thinking about a Roth IRA or investing in stocks, things like that was just not something that came up for me. And part of that is that also wasn't something that my parents did really well either. And so, a lot of our financial planning often comes from, the home that we grew up in, and some parents are really great about it and some parents are not. We were very much a paycheck to paycheck household. And so as far as I knew, that's just how life went. And it didn't seem like that would be a problem for me. It didn't seem like I needed more than that. As things got better, I can probably when Orkambi came out was probably the first time I was like, oh, not only would I maybe need to start thinking about financial planning for myself, but I would maybe need to start thinking about financial planning for my family. And so this was a kind of a turning point where I had to have a more internal conversation about, would it be appropriate for me to have a family if I wouldn't be able to financially plan for them? Is it something that I want, but something that would just not be, very responsible of me to have children and things like that, and then die young and leave them with potential medical debt, leave them with just kind of overall debt, things like that, and student debt. And so it was definitely a conversation that I had to have. And so I definitely, from that point on, as I realized I do want to go to college, I do want to go to family, had to start kind of planning long-term for what that would look like for me, and had to have some really hard conversations with myself about the sacrifices that I would have to make and kind of some of the career decisions I would have to make in order to ensure that long-term I would be sustainable, and that if I were to eventually have a family, they would also be sustainable after I passed. So, some of those things, really investing heavily in scholarships, looking for scholarships at school, things like that, trying to live, very within my means. We know that it's more expensive to be lower income than it is to be middle income, right? As we delay things because I just don't have the money, unexpected expenses come through, we get a ticket, we get a car maintenance, we get whatever, and all of a sudden it gets, right, the late fees pile up or things of that nature happen. And so doing my best to kind of live within my means and find things like that. So currently, as Siri stated, I work for the state. Part of that was to access public student loan forgiveness. I knew that I was going to take a pay cut in terms of perhaps what I could do, but being able to have my debts paid off and be able to have a pension was something that I knew I needed. Not to mention, having access to a pension moving forward. Which, was also something that I was like, can I not pay into my pension? Because maybe I won't need it. Can I take that money now? Because I certainly need it more now than I may need it when I'm 65, which would be wonderful if I make it to that. But, having to have those kinds of really intense conversations around how do I plan for my future? What does my future look like? People with cystic fibrosis, people, with rare disease largely, don't have a guaranteed future, and it's really hard to plan for something that we have no real idea or certainly not guaranteed. So those kind of conversations are difficult. And then that's also something that I really try to build into any of my relationships, romantic or familiar, is, what my financial situation may or may not look like in the future, and how best to, bring that up around debt, around leaving this world a little earlier than intended, and what kind of burden that could put on my partner or on my family members, and making sure that we're having those honest conversations as we move through our different stages of life. The conversation that I had with my family when I was 21 is very different than the conversation that I have with my parents when I got my job at the state. And understanding who my life insurance beneficiary would be, understanding where and how I would like what money I have left spent. So that's kind of the overview. If that conversation is ever changing, I will have a different conversation, hopefully in another 10 years, and so on and so forth. But there's definitely strategies that I've employed that we'll get into throughout, as well as ways to engage in those conversations with family and with partners moving forward.
I must say I'm very impressed, because the one thing we do know, what is like one of the most uncomfortable topics for people, finances, money. It's I think that's part of the problem with this whole issue. And people are more comfortable speaking about sex than they are about finances and planning. So that's wonderful that you're having these conversations now and thinking about it. And I think that's a message that you can keep sharing with others to inspire people to have their own conversations. Georgia, can I turn to you and ask you the same question, whether your attitudes about financial planning have changed, and if so, why?
Well, they've changed a lot. And I, too, like Jacob, didn't think I would live very long. My parents expected me to die before I was able to drive. So that was kind of what was always in my mind. And I always wanted to go to college, so I started going to college, and that's when I started getting really sick. And I had to make some decisions on how I was going to handle that. One of the things I did was I put one of my parents on my checking account, because if I was in the hospital and I was having issues, I was going to need somebody that could pay my bills. My health deteriorated to the point where I had to go on disability. And that has been a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because I was able to get the medical coverage that I needed, because back when I was when I was trying to work, there was no ADA. So I lost employment because I missed too many days of work. And there were no protections if you were sick. And that was really hard during that time. And then I was very sick, in and out of the hospital every 3 months. So I needed my parents to help with those things. You talked about getting a car. When I bought my first car, I had a 3-year loan, and my thought was, I don't know if I'll live long enough to pay off this car. And I ended up having that car for 10 years. So I did pay it off, and I love that car. But everything was kind of like kicking the can down the road. And when you're on disability, I was able to focus on my health, and my health improved enough that I wasn't going in and out of the hospital as much. And I had the coverage I needed at this time. Like, they would cover 3 prescriptions a month, and I was on a handful. And there was no Toby, there was no Pulmozyme. So there was no way of knowing how my health would be. And of course, when you're on disability, you can't have any assets. You can't have any money in your checking account. These things work against you for getting, your Medicaid, which helps with your Medicare coverage, because Medicare does not pay for everything. It only pays 80%. It helps, with your prescription costs and some of your other medical needs when you go into the hospital. So I also needed food stamps because I didn't work very long. I did not get very much money in Social Security disability. And that also meant that I could never live alone. I either had to live with my parents or find a roommate that was willing to compensate what I could not cover, because I was unable to work, both with my health and the regulations for the program. So when I turned 30, I was just amazed and had no idea what I was going to do with my life. When I turned 40, I was shocked, and my mother cried and said, "We didn't think we would have you this long." And this year I will turn 50 and I realize I have nothing. I have no retirement, I have no assets, I have nothing in savings. And you know, while I'm not on a modulator, my life has obviously been one where I'm surviving, and I have to think about how I can face the next 10 years of my life, because I never thought I would get here, and now I feel completely unprepared. And that's one of the reasons why, after attending the retreat and having that great talk, I was saying to you, we really need to have ways that people can start planning now, because this isn't the death sentence it used to be. And we need these strategies and this knowledge moving forward so that we can navigate some semblance of a normal life, which I just never thought I would have. And here I am going to be 50 and I'm completely overwhelmed.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's why I am looking forward to Beth Suffian's presentation where she can address, because it really is a double-edged sword of security at the time, but how will that play out into the future? So thank you, Georgia. And Becca, we are anxious to hear from you about your experiences and thoughts.
Yeah, of course. This is like such a great and important topic. And I definitely wish I had these conversations starting at a much younger age. So I'm really glad to start this conversation in the CF community. So, you know, in terms of my own kind of background and relationship with finances, I came from a very solidly middle-class family and had kind of the unusual blessing of great-grandparents who just were educators, believed in education, and so put money aside for our education, which is huge, and which I think I've understood the value of more and more with each year that passes. But it meant that growing up, while my parents had their own challenges with the degree of like expense of my medicines, we were able to afford them. And I was able to work part-time. So I kind of had a sense of not financial independence, but, you know, I was able to, you know, get the things that I wanted and you know, get a sense of what it meant to make money and to have, you know, not a career at that point, but that aspiration. So anyways, I was able to go to college and work through college because my health allowed me to, you know, make money for spending money, and I had my education covered by my great-grandparents, which was huge. When I graduated from college is I think where things started to get real. And I was fortunate in that I landed a job very quickly with very good benefits. I fully understood that at that time you did not stay on your parents' benefits. You know, you didn't have that option until 26. So I started working at a really top-notch employer in terms of benefits and felt like I had it made. My employer shifted once in that period, and it was shocking. I still had good insurance, but it changed, and I got a $1,500, you know, copay, and that was the first time I'd had one of those copays that was basically the amount of money I was taking home from work in the course of a month. And so I think that was when I really started to realize that I had to understand a little bit more the options of how to manage expenses. My job had flexible spending accounts where you put it all aside, and then like you have a credit card to use each month, so you can distribute costs across the year. And I've always worked at places that have capped out of pockets. And so, you know, when I look at an insurance plan, obviously I care about the network, and I care about the prescription benefits. And more than anything, I just want to know, what's that top number? I'm probably going to hit it. What's the top number for copays? What's the top number for, you know, for procedures? And then I just, if I can get a flexible spending account to distribute that cost over the 12 months, great. You know, if not, I do have credit, so I can, you know, get by that way if I need to sort of try and bring the cost over a month or two if it is really bad 1 month. But that was sort of the first time I had to think about it. And then as I worked for a while and decided that in the long run, again, my health was still good enough that I could more or less work full time, I decided I really wanted to be a genetic counselor. The only program that really interested me, because I wanted to set myself up to be in my support system, didn't actually have much in the way of a student insurance plan. They kind of farmed you out to some, you know, company that would hear your pre-existing condition and be done with it. And so that wasn't an option. And so as I was preparing to enroll in graduate school, I and my parents especially got very creative, and we didn't, again, have really great resources in terms of the CF center I was at. It wasn't really clear that anyone there was looking out to be like the expert on these issues in Pennsylvania state. We were fortunate enough to recognize that in Pennsylvania state, was a program that I think still exists called Medical Assistance for Workers with Disabilities. And that was huge because it meant that I could get reasonable health insurance that covered my costs very inexpensively. And I could even have like a work study job. So it didn't preclude me from like making a little bit of money while I was in graduate school. And so that was huge. However, you know, what Georgia was mentioning applies to that type of medical assistance as well, where I couldn't have any money going into that. So I like spent some money to go on it. Meanwhile, then I got a tuition bill, you know, 6 months later, but I couldn't start the program without it. So it's, you know, it's just a really unfortunate system where, you know, there was no way to distribute the spending of money in a better way. Maybe there's some educational fund I could have like somehow dumped the money in that would have been protected, but I didn't know to even ask those questions. And it's not as though I had tons of money at that age, but it alerted me and my parents, right? I have very involved protective parents, to the fact that assets were not always a good thing, and that assets could actually complicate your life when trying to get health insurance. And so that created what I think is an ongoing dilemma for me personally around, you know, how much you really want to have in the bank. And in Pennsylvania state, like, it does seem like as though you can have housing. So I did, when I was working later in my life, managed to buy a condominium, which was huge. But that's the only thing I'm like, you know, for quite some time was comfortable having in terms of an asset. And it definitely didn't inspire me to put into retirement. So I still have always put the minimum in. I don't have tons of savings in retirement. And I think one of the challenges when I think about sort of psychologically where I am with finances, as well as the planning and the actual use of money, is like my life is a zigzag, because it's me sort of just paying attention to my body, paying attention to what I honestly in my gut feel is smartest in terms of my health being the ultimate resource, day to day, week to week. And then, you know, the expression is so American, keeping up with the Joneses, looking around and being like, what are my friends doing? What are my friends doing? What do my friends have? What are they worrying about? And like, those have been honestly the worst moments in my life in terms of making decisions for my health. There have been these moments, you know, there may be 6 months, a year, 3 years, where I'm like, no, I have to meet that goal because other people are, and because it does matter. I mean, towards what Georgia is saying, like, it does matter in the long run. But I can tell you, for me personally, with the state of my health, and especially my 30s, where I started to, I think, feel CF more, it was not a good decision for me to be super concerned with finances and to be trying to, you know, live very cheaply and to be spending my money in such a way that I was like, and trying to earn more money in order to have, you know, savings, because it just didn't cohere and align with where my health was at. And I just really honestly didn't have the energy to put in those types of hours. And even things like having a roommate, like there's more germs, like things like that, I think were not the best decision for me in retrospect, because it was not like I couldn't pay my bills. Like, that's one thing, but it's another thing to like want to accrue assets for a future that you're diminishing because you're not being as good with your health. So I think that is a really hard situation to be in, that I'm glad we have a space to talk about. And I think that, you know, with the advancements of modulators, I didn't feel any impact until the most recent TRICAFTA, which I'm hugely fortunate about. And I'm seeing like a future open and work opportunities shift, so that for the first time I can think, okay, not just how do I have a part-time job that gives me insurance, like that was my thought before, and, you know, a sense of purpose and hopefully an independent place to live. But oh, maybe I could actually like do this, you know, thing that I really want to do. I'm a doctoral candidate. I'd love to be a professor. And so I'm, yeah, in this strange process of being like, oh, maybe that's actually realistic. But I do not want to forget for a second that it is not worth my health, you know, to make that happen, and to do it in a way that really prioritizes in a very day-to-day way, sleeping, you know, and taking care, because I think that that's a really hard balance. And I can work 40 hours a week, but I can't necessarily work You know, I can't work like any hours you want me to. I can't work like 7, you know, can't, like it's a clinic job. I can't work 7 to 3. Like I'm not going to get my treatments done. So I can do this kind of academic work if there's some flexibility, which is I think why I feel excited about it and why I'm like, oh, I could do this like for a really long time. And I can do a lot of the intellectual work even when I am not feeling well. And so that's also been crucial in terms of thinking about what I want to do professionally, is I'm much more drawn to things that I feel, you know, would work in even when my health is going up and down. So anyways.
You addressed so many issues, and really what that raised for me listening to it was, this is a 4-part webinar series, but really it should just keep on going, because we could have a whole session on deciding on health insurance plans. And I mean, if you have the luxury of making decisions, because many people do not, but literally, what do these terms mean? I mean, and again, most people really don't get about what's the copay, what is your cap on out of pocket, and just to literally have a down and dirty 20-minute overview of how to read your insurance claim would be, I think, very, very helpful. And also just your pointing out the double-edged sword, how to pursue goals and maintain your health at the same time. And sometimes it may lead you down a path that you are accommodating your health by necessity. So in thinking about financial planning and strategies, what do you have, and I put this out to all 3 members of the panel, what experience do you have or knowledge about strategies of different ways to plan for the future? I mean, it's such a general term, right? Financial planning for your future. What does that mean to each of you when you hear that term? And I think I'll loop to Georgia first, and then I'll swing back around.
Well, I think financial planning for me, at this stage in my life, is contemplating what happens if I have to go into a home for end of life. So whereas I thought I was dying young, now I have to think about those years of end of life care and what that means, and trying to figure out what, you know, what if anything I could do for retirement, and you know, having the Social Security, but then really thinking about if I needed assisted living, if I, you know, and I never thought I would think about living that long to have to even concern myself with, you know, what happens when I'm 60, 70 and I need more help than I can provide myself. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is my parents aren't in the best of health, and making sure that I have a way to handle those issues when and if they arise.
I actually had a conversation with a woman recently who's many years past transplant, who said it's the first time she's actually thought that a life goal for her is to be around to care for her aging parents, because nobody in that family structure ever anticipated that that would even be an option. So really interesting perspective, and we can hope. And you know, again, we're an interesting community about our ability to talk about things. Many people back away from the topic of death and end of life planning, and I think by necessity, many of us have had those thoughts, those conversations, and I think that will be helpful in the long run. So Jacob, why don't you share with us, you know, when you think about financial planning, what comes to mind for you?
I think the 2 things that come to mind for me the most is resourcefulness and humility. As people with cystic fibrosis or rare disease broadly, we are resourceful people out of necessity, right? We've had to be resourceful from day one in terms of how we meet our needs and how we, you know, move forward. And humility, much to like Rebecca's point, like I have a lot of friends who are buying their first homes. I have a lot of friends who are, you get to travel and do these things. And I just have to acknowledge that that's not me. And I love them and they love me, but they don't have a chronic illness in the same way that I do. Also, as a person of the LGBTQ plus community, we are already kind of economically disenfranchised. And so there's additional barriers, right? That, you know, anybody, you know, we don't have just one identity. We're not just people with cystic fibrosis. We're women with cystic fibrosis. We're people of color with cystic fibrosis. We're trans. We're whatever. And so when that intersection comes into play, there's a lot of, there could be a lot of barriers that, don't just associate with my cystic fibrosis. And so I have to acknowledge that, for me, some of that humility is like, I'll probably have roommates for the majority of my life in order to keep my costs down, and that's okay. And I'll probably never get to buy a brand new car because I got to buy a used car, so I don't have payments, so it's one less thing, you know what I mean? So there's so many ways that I just have to go, these would be great, but that's just not for me, and that's okay. And I have to be resourceful. We're lucky in California growing up, as Georgia talked about some of the asset limits and things like that nature. California has done a really great job at expanding that, allowing, double dipping and things like that. When we were growing up, you couldn't have your Social Security and food stamps. You can only have $2,000 in your bank account. You could, count your car as your asset, things like that. And so there was like a lot of things that I had to give up control of. I had to give, my mom a lot of money to like, I need you to hold on to this because otherwise they're going to duck my SSI. Or, I'd really like a new car, but I can't afford an increase in my, assets. So this one just has to last. And so there's a constant conversation with myself of like, Jacob, I understand that maybe this would be great and that you would maybe feel a little bit better instead of pulling up at the event in your, old school car. Or, as your friends are having housewarmings and you're like, I like my room, that I rent. So there's constant conversations around humility and that acknowledging that it doesn't make me less than, it doesn't make me, not as good or not as, average or whatever. This is just how I live my life. And I'll say that also as it relates to financial planning, community is such a huge part of how I live my life. I live my life in community and in support with other people so that when I'm going through stuff, it's not just me. When it comes to meals, right? Like that is such a financial burden for people with cystic fibrosis. In order to like buy all the food I have to buy, how am I supposed to financial plan on a fixed budget when I have to have, so many calories, right? My milk bill every month is like, oh my God, I could buy a brand new car if I just didn't have to buy milk every day. But, so it's just like I learned to find community and share resources. And a lot of us will, who's got a Costco card and who's willing to like go in and let's buy a bunch of groceries together and buy in bulk and separate. And so that in many ways has drawn me closer to the communities that I've been a part of and allowed me to build roots that I wouldn't normally have to. Part of it is out of necessity, but I can also acknowledge a lot of the positive benefits that have, come out of that drive. So whenever I think about financial planning, it's resourcefulness, what programs can I tap into, what free services are available in my community, humility, having those conversations that like, yeah, there's certainly maybe some stigma associated with standing in line at the food bank, but I will deal with that if it means that I keep my BMI up and I stay out of the hospital. And so I'm willing to kind of swallow my pride there. And then community, right? Who else in this community is in a place where they need support, where I can lend a hand there and they can lend a hand elsewhere? So many times where I'm like, I can't afford certain things. And so we reach out to community and it's like, hey, I understand you have this resource. Is there a way that, I could pay you back in another way in what resources that maybe I'm abundant in, that we can, achieve our goals together. And so I'm very lucky that those strategies have worked for me. They're also very unconventional, right? If you go to JP Morgan or whoever, they're not going to be like, oh, so for your financial planning, we really need to think about community. They're going to be thinking about stocks and diversifying your portfolio and things like that. And that's great if those are the resources you have. But for many of us, my resources are very grassroots. And so those are the ones that I use the most and have got me to where I am today. So for me, that's financial planning.
That is such a great point. And, I think we all need to remind ourselves, sometimes we hate to impose on others, but if you do have community, it's almost a gift to identify what your needs are so that somebody can support you. And if you're in a community, you want to do that one for the other. So that was a great way to put it. And you're right. They're not going to assess all the things that are so impactful for financial planning when you meet with the financial planner. And of course, people in our community are all over the map in terms of what capacity they have and what strategies they can employ. So I'm going to send it back to Becca to share her perspectives.
Sure. So, I mean, I think my strategies are pretty basic and simple because I don't have a huge, great long-term plan, but I definitely try to keep my monthly expenses low. So if that means searching tirelessly for the right, place to live, so that just sort of general expense is low, that's obviously like your biggest expense. So just being mindful of keeping within that range. And I think that I don't even think of it as a strategy, but now that I'm hearing Jacob speak, yeah, like I don't take lavish vacations. I don't do most of the things that I've come to really like doing, in part just because of other aspects of CF, and in part out of, being mindful of finances, means that a lot of the things that I enjoy doing most are more or less free. So like my hobbies are hiking and astronomy. Like I go to an astronomy, like they will cost no money. And so I think like I don't even think about how that has really mitigated an impact on like a recreational budget, but it really does. And I chose hobbies based on the fact that I don't like to be in enclosed spaces with people during flu season. I mean, that's really where a lot of my interest started. So it happens to be like reinforcing of just not having, big, costs associated with, how I spend my time. I think that, in terms of community, it is very challenging when you do have some discretionary income, who your community is in terms of how other people spend money. So again, I didn't go to graduate school with anything about finances in mind because it's kind of an insane thing to do. But it means that I hang out with grad students. We're all living on this graduate stipend. And so I actually realized how it actually has reestablished what is normal and what's feasible in terms of having a fun, great life while not spending very much money. That I hope to sort of move forward even when my grad friends, leave the area. So I think that's been helpful. And I think that I'm just very clear about my health being the biggest resource. And so not making decisions that allow me to have the most stability with my health often does cost me something. But when I can afford it, like that's how I roll. And I personally think that it is not, although it's not, a financial strategy because I'm not putting money in the bank, I really do believe that my approach, and as much as you have any control over your health, which we all know is limited, I do really hope that the way that I'm living and thinking about my career and how I use my time will allow me to sort of work longer. So like, for example, my health was declining last year, and I was really fortunate in that I had the option to kind of get my bills paid by working part-time versus staying in a doctoral program. And so I took a leave for a year because I could just tell that I was wondering my health by trying to do multiple things. And I could pay my bills, which I was really lucky, by doing a lot less. And so I did that, and I did that for a year, and it happened to be the year Trikafta came out. And then now a year later, right, like I made no money that year, but now that I'm a year later, I'm able to do a few different things. And so I think being strategic in that way and always seeing your body as a resource. And if there's one area, like I still respect you, Jacob, for how you're managing your food budget. I need less food now, but that has been an issue for me in the past. And I found that if I was too careful about that budget, I really did like not get the nutrients that I needed. Not so much calories, but just like vegetables that are more expensive. So I'm pretty strategic in that like I will have a higher food budget. That's just something that I can do and will do. And like I bought a really expensive piece of workout equipment last year. And I think it was a really good investment. Like my doctor told me it was too germy at the gym, and like, yeah, it's way fancier than I need. It's like my one big indulgence, but it gives back over time, and it's allowed me to continue to work out through the pandemic and other things. So I don't have any like good retirement investment strategies, but in terms of, year to year, how I manage sort of money and energy, those are the things that I have come to live by.
We have a question from a listener who asked, do any of you deal with student debt as an adult with CF? And if you do, how do you manage it? So you can all, you're already here, Beckett, if you want to address it, and then we can send it to Georgia and then Jacob.
I mean, I don't have a tremendous amount of debt, so it is manageable, but I just do an income repayment plan. And then at points in my graduate education, I can have a student deferment. So over the times where I've like done a lot less, like worked less so that it's been harder to pay, I have deferred it some without interest. And otherwise, it's definitely, one of my bigger expenses. And I just do the income adjusted and don't have any brilliant advice for you. I know there's certainly the forgiveness plans if you work at a particular employer that I considered but have never enrolled in. Maybe Jacob can speak.
As much as I don't like to think about it, I would say I have a tremendous amount of student debt. I've got about $90,000 in student debt. So, that was certainly a conversation I had with myself before going to school. I went to community college first and did my AA there for free, Board of Governors fee waiver. Definitely take advantage of that. In California, you now get your first 2 years free if you're a first-time student. Otherwise, you should qualify for the most part for the Board of Governors fee waiver, at least here in California. So all this experience will be kind of focused here in this state. Obviously, there's a little bit of difference. There's obviously federal law that regulates some of the education pieces, but do that research. Scholarships. There are a ton of cystic fibrosis scholarships. And as I said, your CF is only one aspect of your identity. There are scholarships for people who like jeans. There's scholarships for people who don't drink coffee. So like, do your research, right? Like there's so many scholarships out there. We could have a whole thing on like how to apply for scholarships as it relates to, don't spend your time doing a 5-page paper for a $500 scholarship when you can do a 3-page paper for a $2,000 scholarship, right? So there's definitely some resourcefulness there to engage in. Really research your institution. A lot of them, will give you, there's a lot of institutional support for certain degree programs. So for social work, for instance, if you do Title IV-E, you go into the child welfare system. Obviously, that's not for everybody, and I'm not saying oh, get your college paid for and go to the child welfare system. Don't do that, only if you want to. But Title IV-E will pay for your graduate program, and then we'll guarantee you a job for at least 2 years outside of your deployment. So not only do you get your degree paid for, but you have a job kind of lined up, ready to rock and roll when you leave. That was not something I wanted to do. It was certainly a conversation I had. I was like, oh my God, this would be incredible. But I had to be honest with myself in terms of what I wanted out of my career and out of my own life. And so I knew, okay, if I can't do that, then I need to get a job that would allow me to get the public student loan forgiveness, which is, it's an income-based payment for 10 years working for, it could be nonprofit, it could be public service, and that's government, you could be a firefighter, that's pretty broad in terms of where you can plug in. It doesn't have to just be working for the state. You could work for your county, you could work for anything that's considered, government public, and then certain nonprofits as well. And so after 10 years of being there, paying you as long as you hit all your payments, they just forgive what's left. So under public student loan forgiveness, I'll probably only have to pay back maybe $40,000 over those 10 years. So that's $50,000 that's just going to get forgiven. So that is incredible. There's other programs similar to that. Teachers, if you were to become a teacher, as long as if you get placed in some of the more inner city or kind of low rated schools, if you're there for, I think, 5 years, you get full forgiveness. California has been really working to expand what that forgiveness looks like for folks. And really, so do some research into where do I want to go and what programs are available to help me there. A lot of companies and departments will also give you a certain amount of money a year to put towards your student loans. So I have a lot of friends who work in the Bay, and a lot of their companies give them $1,000 to $2,000 a year that they can put towards their student loans. Obviously, that's not a ton. And for someone like me, that's oh, great. So, in 45 years, I could pay it off. But depending on what your loan amount looks like, that's obviously something that could be a great benefit to you. To be honest, I had the full conversation with myself of well, if I die young, I'm not responsible for my loans. So, you know what I mean? That's one burden that for me, now that's only through federal. If you have a private loan, which I highly suggest you try to stay away from, try to do the direct or direct plus loans, because private loans will continue regardless of what happens to you. They will continue to get that money back. But because I have federal loans, low interest rate, and then if I were to die, they're gone. My family is not responsible for that. My partner would not be responsible for that. That was a huge weight off my off my shoulders of if I do pass early, I'm not going to be saddling my family and my partners with tens of thousands of dollars of debt just for my student loans. So definitely look into that. Try to budget. I took out as little as I needed. my program at Berkeley itself was 50,000. And then that original 40,000 was to like sustain myself. Going to school in the Bay Area is expensive. And that's a public university. Private universities are different. Research your university. If you go to like Stanford, if you get into Stanford, if your parents make less than $150,000 a year, you get their tuition free. So there's other programs like that that are kind of built into institutions that you can really take advantage of. Again, we could have like a whole session on just navigating like the college institution space and how to do like the financial aspect, how to manage your health, how to do the academic parts, totally. So Siri can send out my contact information for those of you who maybe have more specific questions or would like to talk more in depth about it. Totally open to do that. It is a hell of a navigation. I'm very privileged to have a lot of learned experience and have a lot of knowledge in that. And so definitely here to share and pass that on as you know, as those of you want. But yeah, there's tons of ways to navigate it. Part of that conversation was just, I'm gonna have debt and this is something I have to budget for. So, you know, this pandemic is kind of cool. I don't have to worry about my payments until January. I probably would have had to start worrying about them in November. We could talk about how coronavirus affected student loans. That was a lot of the work that I did when I was working in the Capitol before coming here to the governor's office. So, you know, there's obviously some destabilization there and some changes there. Why I was gunning for Elizabeth Warren, I was like, cancel these student debts, but that's okay. So that's a pipe dream. We'll keep that in the back burner. But yeah, so starting in January, I'll probably have like a $500 additional payment. So that is something I'm already budgeting for and trying to recognize, okay, how much am I spending now? Can I continue to spend at my current level and have money for that? Or am I going to need to make some adjustments starting, you know, November, December to start accommodating that extra $500 payment? So, you know, trying to think out, trying to plan out, trying to do the best that I can. And yeah, also acknowledging that I'm going to be rocking and rolling in the public sector for 10 years. So luckily I love doing this work, so it works out. But again, those are conversations that we can have offline or in another forum that's we could do a deep dive. But lots of strategies there.
And what Jacob hasn't mentioned is that last year he worked as a legislative aide for an assembly member in the Capitol. So he has lots of knowledge. And you're thinking about colleges, because my daughter graduated from college. And at first I thought, you know, all the state schools, that's the way to go. And typically they are, right? I mean, the community college to state college is usually the most feasible way. But you were right. It was stunning to me when she did apply years ago, how some of the most costly private universities have the best endowment funds. And so they were actually cheaper if she had gone there than a state school. So it's just an interesting perspective. And you actually had a perfect segue, Jacob, to the final question. And so just stay with us here, because we've mentioned, okay, analyzing how to choose health insurance, analyzing how to analyze your bills, medical bills and insurance. About student loans and navigating that. Moving forward, when you think about financial planning and what you would like to learn or what would be helpful, what comes to mind for you? And I'll start with you, Jacob, and then we'll move to Georgia and Becca. And I think this will help us as we move forward, knowing what other issues we want to address as a community.
Yeah, it's kind of tough. And I think in this space, for a lot of people, it's like, I don't know what I don't know. And it's very difficult to say, I have no idea what my savings needs are going to be at 20, right? If you're a teenager with cystic fibrosis, or 30 or 40 or 50, 60. For me, you know, I'm now in a mode where I'm like, okay, I'm just going to plan to live a normal life and do my best to maintain that. So things that I really focus on are long-term healthcare insurance, making sure that I have a plan that either has that covered, or, you know, making sure that that's something that I have kind of in the pipeline for something that I need to get, because people with cystic fibrosis could enter into long-term care at any time, right? Like for us, long-term care is not something that's going to happen potentially 70, 80. It could be at 30, right? It could be 40. So those long-term care is definitely something that we need to be thinking about. You know, starting to learn to live on a budget, because a lot of people, we have fixed incomes, people with cystic fibrosis, especially as you move into long-term care or retirement. You're going to be on a fixed income. And so learning already to learn, like, how do I budget with limited amount of money? How do I make things work? What are things I can live without? What are things I cannot? And so trying to make sacrifices where it's appropriate. And then, yeah, having these conversations. The worst time to be having a conversation about, oh my God, how am I supposed to like live on a fixed budget, is when you don't have a choice. Right? So having these conversations with your family about, you know, hey, I might need to move back in, or I may need greater support, and, you know, setting up potentially paid caregiver relationship with a potential family member who says, you know, that this is something that would be willing to take on. Not a fun conversation, right? That's a super awkward conversation to have with family. It can be kind of like messy, it can be kind of sticky, but it's something that you want to have when things are steady, rather than when you are in kind of the throes of it and you are in the hospital, you got tubes all over and you're trying to just breathe. And then you're like, oh, I also now need to have some sort of really intense, in-depth, deep conversation about what my life is like when I'm this, you know, recovers. So have those conversations early and often, you know, constantly be updating, find out who those people are in your life that are going to be able to be supportive of you. And because their role in your life may change and they may not be able to take that role. And so you want to be having those conversations early and often about what that's going to be. So make sure you are thinking about long-term care. That's something most Americans in general don't think about until all of a sudden they need it. Something that we've been working on at the Capitol level. I'll update you guys as we move forward. But having that long-term care conversation, have some real talk conversations with yourself about what you can and cannot live without, and be planning for that day one, and then begin to have relationships and conversations about what caregiving needs you may need and what your financial situation or living situation may look like moving forward. So those are kind of the key points, at least for me.
Thank you, Jacob. And Georgia, when you think about financial planning and sort of gaps in your knowledge or things you wish you'd had more, would have more information about, what would those be?
Well, you know, when I went to college, they didn't have as many scholarships and opportunities that way. And so we've really come afar with, you know, the CF scholarships and the things like that. But what I think about most is, you know, just trying to pay for myself and understanding. They came up with, I think in 2014, what's called an ABLE or a stable account. And sometimes when you're on disability, you can utilize these resources to help you have a little bit more in assets. So I'm anxious to learn more about that. And also, you know, it's very difficult with things changing, and they change year to year, what the requirements and the limits are for working when you're on disability. If there's something that I can do a little and maybe save some money because I don't have long-term care, and, you know, thinking of who I can potentially rely on later in life, because I've always really pretty much done these things alone. And so Jacob speaks to a lot of hard conversations that need to be had, because basically I just thought I was going to die. And I've never really focused on living. It's always been kicking the can, like, okay, I made it this year. And I never, you know, somebody said, well, you know, like when you did your 5-year plan, and I've never had a 5-year plan. I never felt I had that luxury. So now I really feel like I'm behind on this planning, and I feel this urgency to scramble to see if there's things that I can do to kind of not be so anxious and stressed over it. So that, you know, 10 years from now, I'm like, okay, well, at least I started 10 years ago and I have something, instead of being 50 and saying, I have nothing, absolutely nothing. I know nothing. I don't have anything. So I think, you know, if I can try to calm those fears and maybe help, this program can help with my anxiety, I think that for me would be a first step.
Thank you. That's excellent information. And you're right. And as we all know, all the connections, your financial status will impact your health, your mental health will impact your physical health, and all of these are intertwined. So thank you. This actually really will help us as we move forward with this to focus the conversations. And so last but not least, Becca, would you share what you see are your gaps that you would love to know more about in financial planning?
I think that as I move from being a doctoral candidate to having what's likely to be a full-time job, I'm really just eager to, at that moment when there's, you know, a structure for employer match of retirement income or savings, to just get a better sense of how to do that. I mean, I think it probably is something I should do, and yet I have a lot of questions from past life experience around disability. I want to have the option to go on disability if I feel like my professional decisions are really shortening my life in a significant way. I can I hope I don't need a transplant, but I can imagine a period where I was out for a few years and then would want to work again and wouldn't want to like squander any savings I had. So I'm kind of interested in that transition of like, how do you maintain eligibility? Can you maintain eligibility for disability? How to, you know, start saving in a more significant way for retirement. And I think those are the main things. I think a lot of us in general, and probably CF in particular, you know, use humor to deal with things that make us uncomfortable. So I am forever joking with my brother and his wife about like, oh, well, you're my long-term care insurance, and, you know, joking about getting a little trailer to put on their property, because it makes me uncomfortable. And they humor me and, you know, ultimately probably would be up for that, but he's older, so who knows? Thank you.
Well, we unbelievably have reached the end of our time. I just feel like we have so much we could talk about, but the great news is we get to return to this. And in fact, the next webinar will be Wednesday, October 14th at 4:00 p.m. Pacific, and that will be with Eric Puzia, the financial planner, who has many different strategies. So I know he will be very interested to hear this podcast before to help him prepare and address some of these questions. So with that, I really want to thank you, Georgia, Becca, and Jacob, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your perspectives. This is very helpful to everyone. And I thank those who joined us today. And just so you know, we will be taking the recording from this and releasing it as a podcast so more people can learn from your wisdom. So thank you all very much, and we will be in close touch. Bye-bye.